Today on Bench Briefs, we're looking at a fascinating case that touches on the intersection of Indigenous governance and constitutional rights. Saddle Lake Cree Nation, number 462 vs. Collins, a 2026 decision from the Federal Court of Appeal. This case explores whether a community's rules around its own election process can stand up to the protections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. At the heart of this dispute is the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, an Indigenous community in Alberta, which held an election governed by its own set of regulations. These regulations included a specific provision called Section 2A that prohibited certain individuals from voting in their elections. This restriction wasn't just a minor detail, it was a significant rule about who could participate in choosing the community's leadership. But not everyone agreed with this voting restriction. Some members challenged the rule, arguing that it violated their democratic rights protected by the Charter. They claimed that Section 2A unlawfully limited who could vote, infringing on their fundamental right to participate in elections. This raised a crucial legal question. Does the Charter's guarantee of democratic rights apply to elections held by Indigenous communities under their own governance structures? And if it does, is the specific voting prohibition justified under the Charter's reasonable limits clause? To unpack this, the Federal Court of Appeal had to consider two main issues. First, did Section 2A of the election regulations infringe the democratic rights guaranteed by the Charter? More specifically, did it violate Section 3 of the Charter, which protects the right to vote in federal and provincial elections, and any related democratic rights provisions? And second, if there was an infringement, could it be justified as a reasonable limit under Section 1 of the Charter, a part of the law that allows certain rights to be limited if it's reasonable and can be justified in a free and democratic society? The court's analysis was careful and nuanced. Indigenous self-governance is a constitutional priority in Canada, and the courts recognize that Indigenous communities have the right to manage their own affairs, including elections. However, this autonomy isn't absolute. When Indigenous election rules potentially conflict with Charter rights, the court must balance respect for Indigenous governance with the protection of individual rights. In this case, the court examined whether the voting prohibition was necessary and proportionate. Was it designed to protect the community's distinct identity and governance structures, or was it an unjustified restriction on democratic participation? The details of the case show that the Saddle Lake Cree Nation's regulation aimed to ensure that only certain members, presumably those with a particular status or connection to the community, could vote. This was intended to preserve the integrity and self-determination of the nation's electoral process. After weighing the evidence and arguments, the Federal Court of Appeal found that while the Charter's democratic rights do apply, the voting restriction could be justified under Section 1. The court recognized that Indigenous communities have unique needs and that their election regulations serve important purposes related to their cultural and political autonomy. Therefore, the limitation on voting was seen as a reasonable and justifiable limit in this particular context. Why does this case matter? It highlights the ongoing challenge of balancing individual rights with collective Indigenous self-governance. On one hand, democratic rights like voting are fundamental to Canadian society. On the other, Indigenous nations have constitutionally protected rights to govern themselves according to their traditions and laws. Saddle Lake Cree Nation, number 462 vs. Collins, shows that courts are willing to respect Indigenous electoral rules, even when those rules limit participation, provided there is a solid justification that aligns with the principles of a free and democratic society. This decision also sends a clear message that the Charter applies broadly, but its rights are not absolute. Reasonable limits can be placed on rights to accommodate the unique circumstances of Indigenous governance. This case will likely influence future disputes where Indigenous communities enact rules that intersect with Charter rights, setting a precedent for how those conflicts are resolved. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Join us next time as we break down another important case shaping Canadian law. Until then, take care.